The views expressed on the Nova Society are those of the panelists and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Phoenix Research Institute or any institution which any panel member is associated. Reproduction or dissemination, other than for the purpose of education or information without the express written permission of the Phoenix Research Institute or Nova Society Media, is strictly prohibited.
Society. I'm your host, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and today we're joined by Dr. Nancy Rosenblum, who is the Senator Joseph Clark Professor of Ethics in Politics and Government at Harvard University, America. Dr. Rosenblum is the author of many books on contemporary policy, and Dr. Russel Muirhead teaches American government and political theory at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. Dr. Muirhead has written books on the work ethic, partisanship and polarization, and conspiracy theory. Together with Dr. Nancy Rosenblum, he is the author most recently of Ungoverning, the attack on the administrative state and the politics of chaos. Dr. Muirhead also serves in the New Hampshire legislature. So welcome to you both. Welcome on the Nova Society, and also have, of course, our usual panel, Dr. Scott Gershwer and Dr. Mark Bound. Today we have a wonderful opportunity to speak with Nancy and Russ just after the Trump inauguration and the flurry of executive orders being challenged immediately by lawsuits.
Of course, the both of you have written quite a bit about ethics in politics and what we're looking at as far as a new Trump term, a second Trump term. The question really comes down to is how do people view the Trump, I'm going to say regime, or the Trump administration? How does their education and research inform their decision when it comes to how we view? Is there a difference here? We've talked a lot about this on this podcast, where it seems that the highly educated are more anti-Trump, whereas maybe the lower income and the lower educated are more to Trump. Are you seeing this? Is this something that you believe is actually happening?
Yeah, there's no doubt that the professional class, which was once, say, in the 1950s, almost an entirely Republican group, has been gravitating to the Democratic Party for decades now, and now it's almost an entirely Democratic group. So it's not really a surprise that the sort of credentialed voters with, you could say, fancy credentials or professional credentials, are opposed to Trump. That's the way, the sort of the demographics of the American electorate have been shaping up for a long time. I think apart from that really interesting kind of movement in, American voting patterns, there's just the question of whether Trump is a normal president. Is Trump a president like every other president? He won an election. He won it this time fair and square. He won the popular vote. He won the Electoral College. He gets to be president, and he gets to make policy changes according to his priorities. And I think, some people, there's a very strong desire, even among Democrats, to normalize this presidency. But look, this is not a normal presidency. It's not just about a radical shift in policy. What Trump is up to, what he's already done, is not just change policy. He's really fundamentally altering and maybe even, corroding the norms of, constitutional democracy.
There are so many ways, and you and Brooklyn began to enumerate them to assess what's going on here that is, let's just say, abnormal. But our book offers a special kind of, or a unique kind of lever on this. And the title of the book is Ungoverning. And we think that this is a good way to get at most of the little elements of the other elements that make this abnormal. And so maybe it's useful to start with what this ungoverning is. And then we can talk about why it is that Trump is doing it and what the consequences are likely to be. But ungoverning is really pretty simple. It's an unfamiliar word only because the phenomenon itself is unfamiliar. And what it means is that you disable, you hijack, you circumvent, you derail all of the departments and agencies that do the work of governing, right? A president can offer an executive order, a legislature can pass laws, but none of that happens in real life unless what we call the administrative state, the thousands of employees and departments and agencies, shape these things and implement them and enforce them. That's what governing requires. And what ungoverning is the degradation, the vandalization of this machinery of government. We saw it going on in Trump's first term. We're seeing it going on again. And what are the consequences of this? I mean, nobody likes bureaucracy, but something important is happening before our eyes that is going to degrade the capacity of the United States to operate as an advanced democracy.
So I guess my question, and again, throughout history, Republicans and Democrats, as far as ideology, always shift. If we were back in pre-Civil War times, basically, if you were a Democrat, you probably would have identified more with Lincoln than you would today. And Lincoln, of course, was a Republican. But the Republican Party seems to have, and we've said this before, seems to have shifted to one way for self-preservation. And since this is supposedly the last 4 years Trump can be in office, do you see any opportunity that the Republican Party as a whole, in a we're talking about the political ecosphere, can they shift back? Can they be relevant again? Or must they continue this ungovernance that you are talking about? And I guess my follow-up question to that would be, why does the American people accept this ungovernance? What is the allure to it?
Yeah, great question. And look, the Republican Party today has the Republican Party under Trump has a raft of policies that it's offering, very distinctive policies on immigration, on tariffs, on abolishing diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are policy positions, and they're on mass deportation. That's a policy. It's a program that they want to implement, and they either will or won't succeed at implementing those policies. It'll take a kind of administrative capacity for them to succeed at doing that. But alongside that, there's this other, much more kind of unfocused and destructive promise to simply break the institutions of American national government. Trump's nominee to head up the FBI has promised that what he intends to do is close down the DC office of the FBI and convert it into a museum of the deep state. It's almost like absurd, except that it's really happening. And it could really be done. So that kind of destructive impulse, the insistence on obliterating all expertise from the civil service, such that policymakers can't get good advice from people who know something about the subjects that are being addressed by laws. This isn't going to allow Trump to make good on his policy promises. This isn't going to allow the Republican Party to be a party that does something different in the world. This is simply going to incapacitate government. It'll even incapacitate the Trump administration.
Right, and that's the question going forward. And it will be a war within the Republican Party and within the administration, which is, is your main job to go after the deep state and to bring it all crashing down, or is your main job to govern according to the policies that have been set out? And it may be that there's a divided answer to that question, that some departments will actually operate as normal, and the others, like the Justice Department or the State Department and so on, will not. And we have a lot of evidence from Trump's first term of which ones will go which way. But I think that the question, if you're looking at this from the point of view of ungoverning, is will bring it all crashing down triumph over trying to govern the United States?
Then, and in a way, that's like a psychological phenomenon that some people have if they have, let's say, a toe that hurts a lot. And they say, my toe hurts so much, I'm going to cut it off. And well, cutting off your toe is a lot more painful than what you're dealing with right now. But there's a mechanism in our brains that says this is the right answer. And it's what you're describing is exactly what Steve Bannon has talked about. We're going to destroy the administrative state. We're going to strip it down to the studs, and we're going to rebuild it without all these different unconstitutional preferences or initiatives going into it. And I think the reason that the Republican Party was adept at this was because their small government idea is that, the Constitution doesn't say anything about Medicaid and Medicare. Why are we having it? Basically, the Republicans seem to want an army and very little else when it comes to the federal government, and allow states to do a lot more. And with an apology to my colleague here who's in a state government, I worked for the New York State Senate for 5 years, in which virtually every person that I'd worked with, including the guy that whose assistant I was, went to prison. I'm very unimpressed with state government. and I really don't think that pushing things down to the state level is any kind of recipe for getting things done in a efficient and non-corrupt manner. And I do apologize for that, sir. But,
well, I think Russell doesn't have to worry. He's not in Illinois, because in Illinois, this seems to be like a real problem.
Right. It depends on the state. But I do think that one of the bulwarks against the Trump regime is going to be the states.
And how do you see
in
that?
some cases.
Yeah.
How do you see that the state can stand up to? I mean, they've already put out a memo. I saw that today from the Justice Department that they will prosecute if prosecutors will not, in states, prosecute the illegal aliens. They're ready to do it. The memo was sent out, and it was sent out by the deputy head of justice at this point in time. So how are the states going to stand up when the federal government has put out this almost an edict that you will do this? There will be, and we talked about sanctuary cities and sanctuary states the last podcast, and to me that's really an ideology where they say, okay, you're going to come here, you're going to be safe, we're not going to prosecute, we understand the system is broken, and we're going to facilitate you into this. Now you've got the federal government, the acting, I guess, the deputy director of the Justice Department saying, no, you can't do that anymore. So how is the state going to stand up to these kind of pressures from the federal government?
I think it will be, increasingly difficult, especially on immigration. States, on the other hand, I think that there's only so much that the Department of Justice can do to completely govern state policies. So certain states, I think, will be able to continue to run their own policies. Maybe not, they won't call them sanctuary states or sanctuary cities to put targets on their backs, but they can have, different policies and different priorities than the federal government does. But I think, looking at the pressure that Trump wants to put on California to reduce California's ability to legislate more stringent environmental restrictions, or have its own kind of regulations about electric vehicles, I think it's going to be, there's a way in which I think states that disagree with Trump's priorities are going to be harassed. And harassment is one of the strategies of the Trump administration. They're going to harass, they have been harassing the media. Look at the settlements that have come out to avoid, defamation suits. And so this is going to be very, very chilling for media output, for media entities. And I think that they're also, going to harass universities. And so, I think the strategy of harassment will put a lot of pressure on states, on companies, on universities, and on the press.
Well, we've seen it already when you've got a senator standing up and saying, California, we may not help you with your wildfires.
Right.
I mean, that is a prime example how it's using intimidation, and in some ways it's using blackmail, where you will either toe the line or we'll let Los Angeles burn to the ground.
Yeah. We saw that during COVID, where governors that didn't basically submit themselves to Trump and kowtow to him and praise him personally were at risk of not being supplied with, protective gear, such as masks for their first responders and hospital workers in the opening months of COVID. And so this is the kind of, I think this is also consistent with Nancy and I are talking about it with respect to ungoverning. The government, instead of being a policy state where policies are administered, neutrally and impartially across the country. For instance, in the Biden administration, lots of look at their, broadband initiative, billions of dollars for broadband, for bringing broadband to rural areas. Most of those areas contain high concentrations of Trump voters. And of course, for the Biden administration, that's irrelevant. They want to bring broadband to American citizens, not just to Biden voters. But under this administration, politics becomes about pleasing the leader and submitting to the personal will of the leader. And that's not governing. That's what I mean. It's ungoverning. It's kowtowing to the personal, will, often unpredictable, capricious will of one person.
So I have a question pursuant to California. Is there any way for California to really push back?
I mean, I think that this idea that the president won't declare a disaster for states that tend to vote Democratic is such a grotesque, violation of the basic idea that the government is there to serve the common good and to serve urgent human needs, regardless of who those human beings are. I mean, the pushback ultimately has to come from citizens. The idea that the federal government's only going to serve states that have governors who are acceptable to the president is, a complete and frontal just violation of the elemental norms of good government. Now, if American citizens, if 60 million American citizens think that's okay, the job of that it's perfectly good for the government to be an operation that exists for the sake of rewarding the president's friends and harming the president's enemies, if that's what tens of millions of Americans actually think the government's there to do, then all is lost. I mean, American democracy is gone. And, we need obviously I have confidence that the population is going to recoil against this. There are plenty of, most people whose homes were burned are just working hard and playing by the rules. They're not particularly political. They're some of them will be Democrats, some of them will be Republicans, whatever. And I think, to respond to their calamity as a human, as in a human way, is what the American people are going to, I hope, expect the government to do, just as we expect it to respond, in rural North Carolina after a hurricane, regardless of whether the people in those areas are, contain lots of Trump voters or very few Trump voters.
If I could point to a whole other aspect of this ungoverning and of what's going on today. And that is the attack on the administrative state came from Trump's, his basic lie, his basic conspiracy, which is that there's a deep state, right? And that this deep state has to be eliminated. And along with this came 8 years, really, of saying that these aspects of the federal government were controlled by the deep state and that they were illegitimate, that these were illegitimate people and departments and agencies and so on and so forth. Something very important happens. Here's me as a political theorist speaking. What does it mean to say that the State Department as it now exists is illegitimate? It means that no value, but most importantly, that it has no authority anymore because it's ruled by these enemies doing their own thing, right? And when this government no longer has authority, when it's illegitimate in people's minds, this means, and this is so important, that they don't have to comply anymore with these orders. And what we saw during Trump's first administration and during the Biden administration as well were all kinds of rogue people and private armies and agents of Trump non-complying, threatening and intimidating. And the story of these threats and intimidations is a long story that we document and many other people have as well. And the pardons that came out yesterday of violent insurrectionists, which shocked even people within his own administration, the pardons really are an invitation to more of this. They're saying that anybody who comes and supports me through intimidation or threats or even violence, and we're talking about will the states, have the courage to combat some of this? Well, a lot of it will turn on how much violence is out there to be expected. Whether somebody thinks they're going to be Nancy Pelosi's husband, right? Husband attacked. And I think that what we've seen in the past is we're going to see in spades of this non-violent, semi-violent threats and non-compliance of orders that are not, recommended by MAGA.
We'll continue this conversation with Dr. Nancy Rosenblum and Dr. Russel Muirhead in our next episode. The Nova Society is a production of Nova Society Media, a division of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our production partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, our editing partners, Apple iTunes, the largest source of podcasts and music on the internet, Spotify, the most popular platform for the Nova Society, and iHeartRadio, your source for all things music and podcasting. The Nova Society is available on all of these and other quality platforms listed in our description. We'd also like to thank all of our listeners. Without your support, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a question or a comment, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. So for Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, Dr. Scott Gershwer, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Remember, the true power in society is knowledge. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again next time.
Hi, everyone. This is JJ, the co-founder of Good Pods. If you haven't heard of it yet, Good Pods is like Goodreads or Instagram, but for podcasts. It's new, it's social, it's different, and it's growing really fast. There are more than 2 million podcasts, and we know that it is impossible to figure out what to listen to. On Good Pods, you follow your friends and podcasters to see what they like. That is the #1 way to discover new shows and episodes. You can find Good Pods on the web or download the app. Happy listening!